welcome to What's Next in JSS. So in case you didn't tell from the title, this is of course a presentation about the addition of Next.js as a front-end framework in JSS. So my name is Nick Allen. I'm currently an independent Sitecore architect, and I live in Oxfordshire in the UK. And I'm a 7-time and 2021 technical MVP. And as I said, today I'm going to be talking about Next.js. So one thing I wanted to say sort of up front is that I'm kind of presenting this from the perspective of someone who for many years has really predominantly been working on the server side in Sitecore. I'm a back-end developer by trade. So with the last kind of year or two, just because of some of the projects I've been involved in, I've been looking a little bit more closely at things like React, and now obviously Next.js. So I think it's interesting. I've heard the comment before that kind of the idea of JSS was to bring JavaScript developers to Sitecore, but actually what we're kind of seeing is a lot of Sitecore developers coming to JavaScript. So I would definitely put myself in the latter category. So there's definitely stuff in here for front-end developers, but a lot of it I think will be about my experience as a back-end developer moving into the kind of full stack world. So just agenda very quickly, I'm going to talk a little bit about why should we care about Next.js, some of the workflow options we have, how we get started with Next, and then two really important topics when you get involved in Next.js, which are pre-rendering options, SSG, ISG, SSR, and I'll explain what those are, how routing works in Next.js, and then hopefully spend a good chunk of our time looking at a demo solution. So why Next? Well, the first thing, if you haven't looked at Next at all, is that Next is a framework built on top of React. So it's not a completely brand new framework. It builds on top of React, but really as an evolution of the lessons learned from enterprise organizations who are trying to do Jamstack. And a lot of those lessons learned, whether they're from Angular or Vue or React, have kind of been taken on board and trying to sort of put into Next.js to kind of make React, if you like, production ready. One of the really kind of cool things about it is Next's ability to run hybrid models in terms of your pre-rendering. So we will get into that quite a bit today. But it is kind of one of the really cool features of Next, and it's one of the things that definitely sort of drew my attention to it. And Next kind of has a thing called API routes, so we'll look at that a little bit. But effectively, when you deploy Next to certain hosting options, they'll take those API routes and kind of break the app apart and sort of host them as serverless functions, and it will do all of that for you. So again, it's another really cool feature. And then really it comes back to the development experience. So simplified implementation, like things like out-of-the-box script bundling, internationalization. If you've been doing JSS work already, there's no need for a proxy server, an SSR proxy. And just things like 404 pages, 500 error pages are built in, plus things like image optimization and TypeScript support. So I'm not going to go through all of the Next.js features today. They're very well documented on the Next.js site. But there's a lot of reasons why I think Next.js is pretty cool. And if you're not sure, you just kind of need to look at some of the organizations that are currently trusting Next.js. People like TikTok, Netflix, Coinbase, Uber, and Starbucks. So really big brands, big traffic. So there's a lot of good stuff in here, and hopefully we'll get through a few things today. So before you get started with Next.js, you kind of need to think about what your role is within a development team and sort of decide what kind of workflow you want to use. And there's effectively two flavors of that. There's full stack development, which, as I said at kind of the start of this talk, is how I'll be looking at things today. So we're really going to look at the full stack workflow. But it's also important to understand that you can also have a front-end development only workflow. So if you've got front-end developers who don't know Sitecore, don't want to know Sitecore, then there is the option to do pure front-end development on any operating system that supports Node, purely code first, pure Next.js, and completely disconnected from Sitecore. Now, if you are going to do that, you will, of course, at some point need to connect to a Sitecore instance. And there's an additional set of steps that you have to go through to do that, which do present some challenges. So it's important to be aware of those. But really for today, I'm going to be focusing on full stack development on Windows using Docker, SES for serialization, Sitecore first, and we'll see what that means, and connected to Sitecore. So how do we get started? So the prerequisites that you need to install and things like that are well documented by Sitecore. So again, I'm not going to go through all of those today just for time reasons. But I will show you some of the key commands that you need to run, just to kind of try and highlight the fact that it is really straightforward to get up and running with a Sitecore instance using Next.js as a front-end rendering host. And really, the kind of 4 key PowerShell commands that you're going to run are these, and this is a kind of a one-time process. So the first thing you're going to do is pop open a PowerShell window as an admin, install the DevX templates, create a solution by simply using the Sitecore Next.js getting started template and providing a project name. At that point, that's going to scaffold out a solution for you, and we'll take a look at that. And part of that solution will have things like your Docker files. Then you just run a quick init.ps1 command that's going to prepare your container environments. That's things like generating certificates, updating your .env file and your host file. Now, if you're not used to running containers, some of these things may not be familiar to you, but if you are running containers, hopefully that kind of makes sense. And then finally, you'll run up.ps1, which is going to download those container images, configure some things in the background for you, and start your containers. And at that point, you're ready to go up and running. So that's really the kind of 4 key commands that you're going to need to run, all in PowerShell. Now, one thing I have found when doing this is every now and again, you may find some errors when running up.ps1. And if that does happen, I found that if it's errored out before you've actually managed to start any containers, just simply run up.ps1 again. It's not ideal, but it works. And if it errors after starting some containers, but not all of them, then just simply run docker compose down, stop all of the containers that were already running, and then run up.ps1 again. And every time that I've had any issues during that up.ps1 stage, one of those 2 things has fixed it. So once you're up and running, you get back into kind of your regular container workflow, if you like, which is running docker compose down to bring down your environment when you're done, and then running docker compose up in detached mode to bring your environment back up again. So now that we've got an environment up and running, we want to start working with Next. There's really 2 key concepts that we need to understand, and pre-rendering options is probably the most important one. This is the thing that's going to have probably the most substantial impact on the performance of your Next.js application. So by default, Next.js pre-renders every single page in your website. So it literally means that it generates static HTML for every single page in advance, instead of having anything done on the server side or running any kind of client-side JavaScript to generate your page content once after the initial load. Everything is literally pre-rendered as HTML. And this, of course, as you can imagine, results in better performance, better SEO, and as we all know, Google's constantly updating its algorithms, and Lighthouse scores are now more important than ever. So this really can be a massive benefit. However, how you generate that pre-rendered HTML is up to you, and that's a design decision that you need to make. And there are effectively two major flavors of this. So you've got static generation, or SSG, and server-side rendering, or SSR. The difference between those, so they both produce the same thing. The difference between them is when the HTML was generated for a page, or we can actually go down to the component level as well. Then we finally add in ISG, or incremental static generation, which is possibly, for me, one of the most powerful features of Next, especially when working in a content management environment. So ISG effectively allows us to periodically, but only on demand, prefetch and regenerate an individual static asset, but only if it's changed. So in a way, it's a little bit like caching, but it's effectively the best of both worlds. It means that you can statically generate large portions of your websites. You're serving pure static HTML files with no server interaction, but also enabling dynamic content by incrementally regenerating those static files ahead of time. Whoops, not that slide yet. And we can control this. We can decide which pre-rendering option we use on which pages and what parts of the site. So where possible, it is recommended to use static generation, which again means your pages are pre-built, cached in the CDN. But it is also worth mentioning that if we are using ISG, or incremental static generation, we do still need that content delivery server sitting there that allows the site to kind of ping back and see if anything's changed within our data. So if you're thinking it from a Jamstack perspective, we're not quite all the way there, because you still need that CD server there to do ISG. But the benefits of that, I think, are quite clear. So as you can see here, if you are using server-side rendering, you kind of lose some of the benefits of static. Well, you lose all of the benefits of static generation, because every page request has to make a callback to your content delivery server, or the layout service on the content delivery server. So how do we control which pre-rendering option we use? Effectively, there are two sets of functions that we expose in our application at a page level or at a component level. If you expose a function, or if you export the function get static paths and get static props, then we're in the territory of static generation. So get static paths is a method that runs at build times when the site builds. It will go off and effectively fetch a set of URLs that need to be statically generated. And then for each URL, get static props will be called to fetch the data that needs to be supplied to that particular page, which we can then pass into our code. If we are doing incremental static generation, it looks very similar. We still expose the same two functions, get static paths, get static props. The difference being is that we not only pass back the props, but we also pass back this revalidate object. And that revalidate object effectively says, these are the amount of seconds that we're going to wait before we go and check to see if anything has changed in the data. Now, this uses a pattern called stale await regenerate. So effectively, the first person who comes to a page may still see stale content, but that will trigger the process to go and see if anything has changed in the background. That process then, if it detects a change, will regenerate your static assets, and the next person who comes in will then be served new statically generated assets. So if you're running, for example, a website that for compliance reasons cannot afford any content to be stale, you may not have the option of doing that. And that's when you would use something like server-side rendering, which basically, again, as I say, will go back to the server and request the data on every page request. And the way you switch to that is, instead of exporting a get static props method, you basically export a get server-side props method. So now that we understand a little bit about how we can pre-render our pages, how does routing work? So Next.js has its own router, and it's a file system-based router. So it's built on the concept of pages. And in your next application, you have a pages directory, which we'll see. And anytime you add a file into that page directory, you've effectively created a route. Behind that is Sitecore provides us with a page props factory, which has a simple job to do, which is basically to say, given the current context for the route, I need to convert that, amongst other things, into a Sitecore path. So I know which content I'm supposed to be fetching from Sitecore for a given route, and it will call the layout service and pass in that path to make sure that we're serving the right content for the right. Now, in Next, for simple scenarios, you can create predefined routes where, for example, in your pages directory, you could say, I've got an about page, I've got a contact page, I've got a services page, index is index. But for more complex scenarios, such as Sitecore or any other CMS, really, we obviously don't know ahead of time what our pages will be, because that's in the hands of the content authors. So we need to use dynamic routes. And they kind of behave like wildcard items in Sitecore, if you've ever used those. There's 3 types of dynamic routes that we can define. So, for example, if we have a blog, we can define a route underneath the blog directory called square brackets path, and that will match blog 1, blog 2, blog n, effectively any child underneath the blog directory. We can also define catch-all paths, which use square brackets ellipses path, which will match not just the children of the blog page, but all of the descendants of that page as well. And then finally, we've got a catch-all optional dynamic route, which effectively behaves the same as the catch-all route. The difference being is it will also match blog as well, so it will sort of serve content for that route as well. By default, when you create a boilerplate solution, when you run the getting started scripts, you're going to have a single catch-all optional route called square brackets ellipses path. What this means is effectively any request that comes in will be captured by this route. It will capture absolutely everything. And by default, that route will use incremental static generation. So by default, you've kind of got the best of both worlds, which is statically generated pages that also support dynamic content. And it's also, this is one thing I kind of found recently, which is the context that gets passed into get static props, this context parameter, which will also, by the way, get passed into get server-side props, contains information about the current route. But this is the key part here, but only when you're using dynamic routes. So I said in the previous slide, you can use predefined routes if you're targeting a specific page by name. But if you do that, the context that gets passed in will not contain any information about that route. And you'll see why that's important a bit later on. So if we've got a route, for example, which is blog square brackets path, in the context that gets passed into get static props, we will have an object on the context called params, an object on params called path, and the path will contain information about the dynamic part of that route. Now, the Sitecore page props factory takes that information and uses it to extract a path for the Sitecore item that we are serving content for. This, by the way, does not have to be called path. It's called path in the Sitecore boilerplate. You can call it absolutely anything you want to. And what will happen is simply the name of the object on the params will change depending on the name that you've given to your dynamic route. So, as I mentioned, the page props factory is responsible for mapping that route to a Sitecore item that represents a page. But let's think about a couple of scenarios here. So, for example, if we are using incremental static generation by default for all pages, but I want to take over a particular page For a predefined route, now this might be, for example, you're running a marketing campaign where you've got a landing page, and that landing page isn't going to change for the life of that campaign. So there's really no need to sort of incrementally check back to the server to see if anything's changed. We just want to serve it completely statically for maximum performance. That's one scenario we might want to do. Another one might be, like I mentioned before, you may have a site that for legal or compliance reasons cannot afford to serve stale content to people. And I've worked on projects in the financial sector that are exactly like this. You may want to take over a section of pages using a dynamic route. So, for example, if our blog couldn't be stale for whatever reason, we could perhaps take over that particular directory and everything underneath it. Both of these scenarios are completely possible in Next.js, and Next.js is designed to handle these scenarios. And you can do this with Next.js and Sitecore. So you kind of running your site in hybrid mode, where you've got some statically generated pages, some ISG, some SSR. But you do need to be aware that you need to do a little bit of work in the Sitecore page props factory, which again is responsible for mapping those routes to a Sitecore item to kind of handle some of those scenarios. And shout out to Nick Busselman, who kind of helped me through this a little bit a few days ago on Slack. I was having a little bit trouble running mixed mode pages, and he pointed me in the right direction. So shout out to the Slack community. If you're not on Slack, I encourage you to get yourself on there. So with that in mind, that's kind of the end of the slides and some of the core concepts. I want to get straight into some examples now so we can see some of this in action. And what I'm going to try and cover here is going through a walkthrough of the solution and what it looks like, look at layouts and components and how those work, and hopefully we've got time to also get to deploying out to Vercel, and I'll explain what Vercel is in a bit more detail when we get there. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pop open VS Code and just take a look at the solution structure. So obviously, as I'm running on Docker, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but one thing to point out is that in our Docker Compose override YAML file, we have a rendering image, and that is running using a rendering host, rendering host name, which is in addition to the host names that traffic is serving. So we have a host name for our CM server and a completely separate host name for our rendering host, which is running Next.js. And in the Docker build directory, we have a Docker file for the rendering host, which does a very simple thing, which effectively changes the directory to where the Next.js application is, and then exposes port 3000 and basically runs npm run start connected. So that's basically saying to Next.js, I want you to start the Next.js app, I want you to be connected to Sitecore. And under the hood, it's also enabling what we call hot refresh, and we'll see that, which is a pretty cool feature of Next. If we go into the source directory, we've got two folders here. Now, this is a custom iBuild solution, so it's not exactly what you will get from the boilerplate solution, but you have a directory for platform, which is your Sitecore solution, so you would work with that the way that you normally would do. And then we have a directory for rendering, which is the Next application itself. There's a bunch of configuration in here. I'm not going to go into that in much detail today. And then I will point out as well that we've got a data folder and a Sitecore folder. These are for when you are running in code first disconnected mode. So the data folder will be the source of mock data that's being supplied to your Next application. And the Sitecore folder contains manifest files and definitions, so that at the point where you are ready to connect to Sitecore, there is a process to import your data definitions into Sitecore to create things like templates, placeholder settings, and so on. But again, we're not doing that workflow today. We're doing Sitecore first, more from a full stack development perspective. So I won't be touching those folders today. Then we have a public folder, which is a Next convention. So in here, this is assets that you will expose publicly. So you can kind of think of it as like the www root folder in a .NET Core app. So you've got things like your favicon and so forth. And then kind of the key part really is within the rendering application or the rendering directory, we've got a source directory. Inside of there, we have our pages. So if you think back to the slides, this is the dynamic catch-all route that I was explaining. But before I look at that, I'm just going to talk briefly about _app. So this again is a Next.js convention, and this you can think of as being the sort of wrapper around all of your pages. And by default, you'll get Bootstrap. I've replaced that with Bulma. And the entire application is wrapped in a I18N provider, which sort of enables multilingual content, localization, internationalization, etc. So if we think about the next layer down, after app, we have a layout, which is our again our layout file. And in Next, we have a head component, which gives us access to the head of the document, the HTML document. So within there, we can specify things like meta tags, set things like page title, meta description, etc. And here I've inserted free placeholders. So the Sitecore Next.js SDK gives us things like placeholder components or fill components for rendering out rich text, images, etc., as you would expect. But this is in my kind of layout here. I'm just simply defining free placeholders. Then if we take a look at our catch-all route, you can see that here I've actually changed the default behavior, which is to use incremental static generation for all pages, to using get server-side props. I would not recommend this in a real scenario. Again, where possible, you want to statically generate as much as possible, but I'm purely using server-side by default for demo purposes. And this is our context object, which again contains that route information, which is passed into the Sitecore page props factory to map the route to a Sitecore item and populate the data that's needed for the current page from the layout service. So other than pages, we also have a components folder. So components are what they sound like. They are Sitecore components, and I've got a couple of examples here to show you. So before I go into those, I'm just going to bring up the front end of the site that we're talking about here. It's a pretty basic site. So this is currently running on localhost, and we've got some basic Bulma components, and we've got 3 pages. The home page, which is using server-side rendering, which is the default, a child page using static generation, and a page using incremental static generation. The components on this page, however, behave slightly differently. So we've got a hero component, which is a fairly straightforward component. And if I hit the layout service for the home page, you can see that we've got our route, which is the home page, because we've passed that in the item parameter. A JSS main placeholder, and within there a hero component, which has a data source item, and within there a fields object, which exposes the different fields that we have, which are just fields on the template in Sitecore. So in the component TypeScript file itself, we are exposing a fields object which has those fields mapped, and then we're passing those props into our exported function here and setting them using some of those components that I mentioned for rendering text fields, rich text fields, etc. So pretty straightforward. I mean, it's, you know, there's really not a whole lot of code going on there. Our comments component is slightly different. This component is using content which is not coming from a data source, but in Sitecore, I have a folder of comments, and each comment has a username, some comment text, and a set of replies. So this component is doing a couple of things. Firstly, it is using component props. So this is saying, well, instead of allowing the route to define how I get my data for this particular component by calling the layout service, I want to define how I'm going to get the data for this component at the component level. So we're kind of taking that over at the component level. And this particular component is also using GraphQL. So we're exposing get server-side props and get static props. And you may be thinking, well, I thought you could use one or the other. At a page level, that is true. At a page level, you either use static props or server-side props. However, for an individual component can be used in a static context or a server-side context, and in which case the respective function will be called depending on what the current context is for that page. So the code within these functions is entirely the same. It's just when that code gets called is different. So my GraphQL query is actually defined in a GraphQL folder, and we have simply defined a query here, which is going to a context item, which is the folder that contains all of my comments. And it is then picking up the children and then projecting those items onto a type, which has been generated for us by our application called comment. And that's allowing us to then access strongly typed properties, if you like, for the username, the comments, and the replies. The replies is a multi-line, a multi-list field, so it has a target items property. And then the target items are of the same template type as the original comment. So we're projecting those items again onto the same type and bringing back the username and comment. If you want to be able to test your GraphQL queries before sort of publishing them into an actual component, we can use a GraphQL page, which is exposed for us. And here my queries is exposed by default, because I had it here before. And if I hit run on that, you can see that it's returning all of this information all in one go. And obviously that's the power of GraphQL. You define your query, the shape of your query. It's one request. It returns everything back in the same shape as the query. So again, not a lot of time to go deep into GraphQL today, but pretty cool stuff. So the results of that query are returned by server-side props or static props, and we are then effectively iterating over the results to render out our markup. So what I want to do next here is kind of just show you as well as what it looks like to actually define a new component. And this for me was kind of huge, coming from the sort of MVC server-side world, just how quick and easy it actually is. So I've got Bulmer here, and I've got a card component. So I'm just going to create a component for one of these cards. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my renderings folder, go to my feature folder, and create a JSON rendering for card. And I'm also going to need some templates. So let's go ahead and create an interface template. card. And I'm not going to try and put too much of the content on here, but let's just try and manage the username and the handle. So we'll just pop username and handle on here as fields. And then let's create a concrete template for that. We'll set our interface template as a base template. So again, we're doing regular Helix work. I'm not going to worry about icons as much as I would love to pick icons. And I'm just going to set some values on the standard values just for time. And then on our card rendering, we'll just set the data source location to a child folder. And use our new template as the data source template. And then I will just quickly put this as an allowed control on my column. So I have a columns rendering. Okay, great. Now if I refresh the experience editor, and let's add a section. Within here, let's add some columns, 3 columns. And in the first column, I'm going to put this new card rendering that I've got. And we'll create some new content. We'll pop it in the page components folder. And it's telling us that we haven't yet got a JSS component for this. So how do we now create things on the React side or the Next side? Again, this is pretty straightforward. So I'm going to pop open actually I'm going to split my screen here just to show things working from a hot refresh perspective. So let's do JSS scaffold card. And that's going to create it's going to scaffold out a new Next component for me. And here it is. And I'm actually attached to my rendering container over here, and we can see things compiling as we go. So every time I'm adding things, the Next.js app is recompiling and the page is refreshing. So let's quickly throw in some markup here. And I'm just going to have to tidy up. So in JSX, you can't use class. It's a reserved word, so we have to use class name. We'll just get rid of that, that's fine. And how are we doing for time? Then on here, we'll just say props.fields.username. That was our field name. And props.fields.handle. And then, of course, up here, we need to specify this in our okay, so what are we complaining about here?
Around 2-3 minutes left.
2-3 minutes.
Yeah, please just wrap it up.
Yeah,
soon.
Okay, no problem. No problem.
Thank you.
All right, I've got a miss. Here it is. It's this. JSX does not like it when you don't close elements. So if I pop over to Experience Editor, there we go. Just like that. So Experience Editor is hot refreshing in the background. So that's pretty cool. And one thing I just want to show, just to kind of wrap things up here, is that, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to show the Vercel side of things in any detail, but this app is currently deployed to Vercel. I also have another site which is a pure Next.js site deployed to Vercel. It's just pure Next.js. And if I go to my production site, just to kind of show the difference between SSR, SSG, and ISG. So this homepage is using SSR. If I go and change some content here, so let's, for example, change the some text on here and publish that out. And then we'll quickly do the same on the other two pages. So we'll publish this out. Then on the server side, so again, this is a site hosted on Vercel. It has the ability to speak to my local Sitecore instance and basically fetch data from the layout service. So if I refresh this one's going to change straight away. If I look at my incremental page, it hasn't changed yet, but now I have triggered the process to go back and see if it needs to revalidate the content. And if I refresh now it's changed. And if I look at my statics page, this will never change because there's no revalidation happening here. So just a key thing, if you look at the difference in page response times, I'm not running the fastest server in the world. So the home page, there's a bit of a noticeable delay there when you click on it, but static and incremental pages are pretty much instant. So again, that's why, where possible, we want to kind of statically generate things. So quickly switching back to my presentation because I'm kind of running out of time. That's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
And we have some questions coming in. We have one from Summit. So the question is, how does content refresh happen for static site generation?
Yeah, good question. So the answer is it doesn't. Well, it does and it doesn't. So the content for static pages is generated when you build your application. So if I had had the time to show you pushing out a feature branch to Vercel would have rebuilt the entire application, and at that point, my SSG pages would reflect new content. But from that point onwards, they are fixed. There's not going to change for any reason at all. So again, it's only really appropriate if you have something where having fresh content is not necessarily a requirement, unless you use incremental static generation, in which case you'll get that kind of revalidation happening based on a time interval that you specify, and it will kind of call back home and see if something has changed.
Okay.
Yeah, very good question. So how does personalization work with static generation? It doesn't. This is a very key point to bear in mind. So if you, Next.js does, with Sitecore, does support analytics and personalization, but at the moment you have to use server-side rendering. That isn't going to be the case forever. It's my understanding that a client-side analytics and personalization capability is being worked on. So we should see that in future versions.
Yeah, we have another one coming up. How it is integrated with publishing process?
Yeah, so if you're using Vercel, I mean, you don't have to use Vercel. Some people can't, but so you might have other things like publishing to static Azure web apps. But Vercel has a webhooks feature. So once you configure that, you can basically hit that webhook, and at the end of every publication, and that will tell your next application that a publish has happened. And at that point, that will trigger revalidation of content to refresh, but not for SSG pages. Oh, one other thing I'll say about SSG is Next also supports on-demand generation of static pages. So if a page isn't available at build time, it doesn't matter necessarily. So if a content author adds a new page, someone hits that route and it's an SSG route, as long as you have that ISG option enabled, it will fetch the data for that to see if there's anything there, and on demand create a static page for you.
We have another question very similar to this. So Tomas, if you just switch. How about client-side rendering with personalization or A/B testing enabled components? Is Sitecore supporting these features with Next.js static site generator in context with Jamstack?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure whether analytics and personalization is supported with CSR. CSR basically says, here's a static page, but there's certain elements of that page I'm going to render on the client. So once the initial response has gone to the browser, certain parts of the page will trigger a client-side function to go and fetch the content for that. So that's normally things like where if you've got content that's only accessible for a logged-in user or that type of thing, but you can also use it to kind of, again, sort of mix up a hybrid mode between SSG and server-side rendering. So it's a good question. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure if you hit up the headless channel on Slack, somebody else will probably know that.
Yeah, most likely. Do we have any more questions? I do not see them coming in anymore.
No, I don't think so. It was the last question. So thank you very much for your presentation, Nick. We will appreciate the time you took for doing the presentation. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thanks.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.
Now is the time for solidarity in the face of this threat to all of humanity. I implore leaders to stand together and heed this appeal.